And to think, now I only look like I'm a casual stoner. Gotta get into this, because like always, it gets cold when it's nighttime. Oh, by the way, for the people wondering, it's minus 22, not including the wind chill. So do you guys like my hat? It's fucking stylish, isn't it? It's not. It's the worst thing ever. It's also from another beer company that you probably can't see. And you probably just saw how tired I am again. But I'm not here to bitch about I'm tired. I made a whole fucking comic book video about that. What I'm going to talk to you guys about today is something that I brought up a while ago on a couple of podcasts, but I'm going to try and set it in cement. When it came to video games, my childhood was great and not so great at the same time. Now let me elaborate for the people that were wondering. So I grew up in a small town in the middle of the country in Australia. What does this mean? Well, this means that we had very limited resources and most people in the town were quite poor. And that's not to say that people didn't have what they needed, but I and many other children like myself would go to school and not be able to afford the school uniform. In Australia, just so you guys know, every school has a uniform policy where your kids need to go and they need to be dressed in the school uniform. For example, the school I went to, blue and brown pants. Now, when I say pants, I mean shorts, and that means year round. Small poor town. When you guys have to go in and you can't afford your uniform, everyone automatically knows that you're poor. Not only that, but then you get paraded around and people, like by the teachers as well, like this guy doesn't have his uniform, he's gonna have to have detention. And it wasn't just me and another, like a couple of kids, you just couldn't afford the uniform. And eventually you scrape together and you get one uniform. And so you need to guard that for dear life. So what does that teach you? It teaches you that if you ever get your shit muddied, just like, so if you get this uniform and you're like playing, let's just say cricket on the oval, I'm hoping that I'm saying these things and that people from other countries can understand what I'm saying. So if I paraphrase back and forward, it's just because I want to try and convey the same sentence to you in a way you might be able to understand. I'm sorry if I'm sounding condescending. It's just I found that while I've traveled around that some people don't exactly get the Aussie lingo that much. So the oval. So if you're out in the field behind the school and you're playing sport, you don't want to get anything muddied, because then that's your only uniform, and you're going to have to spend either the night washing it, or you're going to come to school tomorrow looking like a sack of shit. So a lot of people in this town where I grew up were poor. What did that mean for video games? Well, it meant a couple of things. It meant that unless it was your birthday or Christmas, and sometimes those were amiss, you didn't get video games. Full stop. As I mentioned before in a previous video, I was lucky. I had older siblings. They were able to hand stuff down to me. So, for example, I had a Sega Master System. I was able to sit down and play things like Alex Kidd, Sonic, and I had NES. And my father used to go back and forward from Malaysia all the time, and he would just pick up all the things while he was over there, while he was living there, and he would come back and he'd be like, this is what I got. And because the Aussie dollar at that time was so favourable to the Malaysian currency, I think it's ringgit, don't quote me on it, he'd be able to, you know, buy these games and I would be able to experience them. However, the downside would be not all of them were in English. For example, my first Pokemon game was Pokemon Green, entirely in Japanese. Then I had Final Fantasy 2 and 3. I don't even know what language they were. But I played through them. Same with I think it was like the Jungle Book and stuff like that, and Bugs Bunny's Mystery Castle 3 or something like that. But I had these games, I didn't know what they were even, and I've played so many games that I still don't know what it actually is, just because it had like a Malay title, or it had like a Japanese title, and I'll just be like, I don't know what it is, I'm having fun playing it though. What does this mean for the other people in my town? It means that if you want to play a game, then you would talk to your mates in your class and you'd be like, what game do you have? And people would be like, let's just use for example, I have Crash Bandicoot 3. And then your mate might say, oh, I've got Crash Bandicoot 2. And you'd be like, well, I haven't played 2 yet. Or, for example, yeah, and you just switch. And you would trade your games. And you'd be like, you can play that one for that now, and I can play this one. And when I say trade, I mean trade sometimes. Like, sometimes you'd make permanent trades, and someone would be like, let's just say, for example, I never had a Nintendo 64. I would borrow my friend's Nintendo 64, and he would borrow my PlayStation, and that's how I'd play Nintendo 64 games. And you see, even though none of us could afford anything, we would always like trade stuff around, and so everyone ended up playing everything. People weren't very like attached to video games back in the day, especially people like myself. We would be considered nerds, and back then it was like a big no term. That was like an insult, and if you were called a nerd, it was something to be offended about. Most people didn't care about their games. Most people had to go and work out on the farm. And so for me, who loved all these video games, I would trade them around and I'd be like, I would love to see all of these. What if I'm missing out on that one game that's just like, see, I was always searching for the next thing. We also had there used to be an old guy, and this is going to sound sketchy as fuck, who used to have a couple of arcade machines. And there used to be stores that you could go to, like bakeries or all that sort of things, that would have those old sort of Pac-Man style things. And this is extremely rare. But because we had some people who wanted to make money off the country folk, they would sell these machines to these businesses for crazy prices, because people in the country just didn't know better. They didn't know that they were buying these old games, and that they weren't popular anymore, and people from the cities would just sell them to them because they needed to get rid of them. Like, for example, I played Street Fighter 1 on the arcade, where you had to really like smash down a button. I played that same Street Fighter on a refurbished cabinet that they bought, and just because it was falling apart, they didn't care. No one cares about keeping the authenticity of the original Street Fighter. If only they knew how rare a Street Fighter 1 cabinet is right now, they'd probably be kicking themselves. But back then, nobody cared. We didn't have Street Fighter 2 for the longest time. In fact, I only got to play Street Fighter 2 when I went to the city for a while. But we didn't get Street Fighter 2 for ages, and we had Street Fighter 1. So, because it was just old hat and they'd pass it down to the country. So I got to play all these games, and I got to really put myself in this lucky position of, even though everyone was poor and usually, you know, we couldn't afford that much, because we all shared with each other, and because we had all these hand-me-downs, not only from like older siblings, but also from the country, you know, trying to make off with a couple of extra dollars on the poor old country folk, I got to play this wide variety of games, and it really, I felt, gave me this sense of culture with video gaming. And while, you know, being into video games wasn't exactly very cool back then, people used to come to me and they'll be like, oh, talk to me about what sort of video games, or what should I get, and blah blah blah. And it was like, it was fun. So I consider myself really lucky that I got to play most of everything. Like, I played a ZX Spectrum, for example. One of my mates, his father was British, and he'd bought this ZX Spectrum, and I think I played Jetpack on it when I went to his house, and I was like, oh man, I wasn't allowed to trade that or get anything, take that at home. That was like super rare, but I got to play that. And so I feel really happy that, even though, for example, I might have only owned a handful of games in my lifetime, I've still played quite a few. Even though I didn't get to finish a lot of these video games, I feel like I didn't turn out too badly, in terms of, like, I've heard some people say, well, you know, I played this one and I really dedicated time into it, and that's completely fine. I really love the fact that you guys have been able to dedicate yourself to playing a video game and perfecting it for so long. But for me, it was all a little bit of bite-sized pieces. I got to have this video game here, this video game here might not have been the full experience. I might have had to wait years down the line until I got my own job and was able to afford purchasing said video games for the full experience. But by sampling all these little video games, I feel it really helped me understand video gaming as a whole. Now, I know this was a bit of a ramble and I might have repeated the same things a couple of times, but I'd really love to hear what your childhood experiences were with video games. Were you like me in the situation that even though you couldn't buy a whole lot of games, you had a couple of mates that you could trade with, or you would sort of plan out with a bunch of kids in your class which ones you wanted to get and you would trade over and see who got who? Or were you one of those other kids that I was talking about that was able to have those full video games and get a couple and add and start a library early on and figure out which ones were your favorite and plan out which ones you wanted and got to finish those? And which games of those did you really like? Do you think that your situation is the better one, having being able to play full games and experience them in their entirety? Or do you like my situation where you got a little bit of pick and choose? I'd love to hear from you guys down in the comments, and I hope you guys have an awesome day. I'm gonna go the fuck to sleep. Holy fuck, it's cold!